Conscious incompetence, the holy grail trap that bleeds you dry. Here is the sting you do not want to admit. The hunt for knowledge is not the same as building skill. It feels productive. Sure. Click and scroll. Buy bam, another indicator. Another system. Another book stacked on your desk, like a skyscraper made of promises. In stage 2, you finally admit you cannot trade with an empty head. But instead of confronting the empty skill, you shovel in tools. The toolbox gets heavy. The hands stay soft. That is the first crack. You are not fixing the gap. You are decorating it. You call it research. I call it dopamine engineering. Every new method whispers, "This one's different, bro." The siren song hits, a custom blend of moving averages. Fibonacci lines drawn like crop circles. Support and resistance painted to look like a safety net. Pivots. Fractals. Divergence. A dash of DMI and ADX for that quant smell. You stitch it all together and christen it unique. The screen hums. The chart looks surgical. Then the market twitches once, and the whole contraption rattles like a shopping cart with a crooked wheel. The text says, you bounce from method to method daily, weekly, monthly, never holding any long enough to see if it actually works. That is not curiosity. That is avoidance with a spreadsheet. The pattern is simple and cruel. You take 3 trades, maybe 5. A stop loss slices you, sharp as a kitchen knife. You flinch. The conclusion is instant. The system is trash. Toss it. Next one. Rinse. Repeat. What looks like adaptation is really fear dressed up as sophistication. The constant switching keeps you safe from the verdict you dread. Maybe the system was not the problem. You crown yourself a top and bottom on hunter because the indicator cocktail says so. The chart spits out a clean arrow at the exact turn. Your mind fills in the rest: precision, control, mastery. That fantasy lets you hold losers because the indicator said you were right. So you add to the red, a little more, and a little more, until the position feels like a backpack full of wet bricks. The tape does not care. It grinds. Tick, tick, tick. Your courage is not courage. It is denial with leverage. You migrate into groups where people post green days like trophy fish. You stare and wonder why the money rains, for them, but not for you. You pepper the chat with questions that feel surgical in the moment and look naive in the daylight. When the answers do not deliver instant profit, you label them smug or fake. They must be lying. That verdict is convenient. If they are frauds, then nothing is wrong with your approach. The ego heals. The account does not. The piece says you ignore the old heads who warn you about leverage. Of course you do. You are stage 2 stubborn, convinced. You know, the one tweak they missed. You crank the size because a small, big win will end the search. The irony bites. The more you fear being a beginner, the more beginner your decisions become. The leverage knob turns like a volume dial, trying to drown out your uncertainty, and the market responds with static and whiplash. No sweat. You tell yourself with a smirk that does not reach your eyes. Just one more adjustment. Then comes the signal addiction. If the custom build fails, outsource the decisions to someone with louder confidence. Real-time alerts. Minute-by-minute tactics. Hot takes piped straight into your nervous system. It feels like an upgrade. It is the same game with a new mascot. You rent conviction because you cannot sit with doubt. You chase precision because you cannot tolerate variance. You buy timing because you refuse to build timing tolerance. The cost is not the subscription fee. It is the erosion of your own decision-making spine. The text admits that this stage can run for 2 or 3 years. That is not a learning curve. That is a drip-feed bleed. Account cycle. Hope resets. Another framework. Another guru. Another template. The calendar flips. The chart does not flinch. You whisper Holy Grail like a prayer and call it process. But here is the darkest. Read. You are not searching markets. You are searching for a version of trading that does not expose you. That version does not exist. And if the quest is really a shield, then what happens when the shield becomes the weapon that keeps stabbing you first? What exactly do you think part 2 of this spiral looks like? You want the cruel continuation. Here it is. If part 1 stung, part 2 is where the bruise blooms. Stage 2 is not just a hunt for tools. It is a ritual of self-preservation disguised as progress. You admit you cannot trade with an empty head. Then you fill that head with canned strategies until it sloshes. Click, click, another template. Ding, another book. Whoosh, another thread from east to west, north to south. The pile grows. Your conviction does not. The text spells it out. You roam from system to system, from indicator buffet to indicator buffet, barely giving any one approach long enough to survive a basic market mood swing. That is not discipline. That is flight with paperwork. You stitch together your unique build, moving averages like railroad tracks, Fibonacci arcs like fortune teller beads, support and resistance grids pretending to be guardrails, pivots, fractals, divergence, a little DMI, a little ADX, the whole soup. Looks clever on the screen, feels powerful. Then price sneezes and your masterpiece sounds like loose bolts in a washing machine. The first stop loss cuts like a knife and you declare the method guilty after a handful of outcomes that do not even qualify as a sample. You are not testing. You are speed dating your way through certainty fantasies. The content says you believe the indicator parameters can pinpoint exact reversals, so you escalate into top and bottom heroics. That belief turns losses into not yet and almost and add a little more. The red grows like a slow leak. You are not cutting losses. You are praying with margin. Listen to the subtext of your own story. You keep adding because the system tells you it should turn here. Not because the tape turned, because the configuration whispered it. That is not conviction. That is obedience to colored lines. Then you wander into groups where the winners stack gains day after day. Your questions flood the chat. In the moment, they sound surgical. Later, they read like you were begging the market to be simpler than it is. When the green posts do not translate to your P and L, you decide they must be lying. It is a protective move. If they are fake, then your struggle stays noble and pure. If they are real, then the mirror gets loud. The text admits it. You think you learn the same material and even more. And yet, your equity curve still bleeds. So, you indict the people, not your process. It preserves ego and extends pain, perfect symmetry. Now, the leverage tick up. I have seen it 1,000 times. The veterans tell you size is a blade. You shrug. In stage 2, you are allergic to being the small fish. You twist the risk knob, because one oversized winner would end the embarrassment and crown your method. But every click amplifies noise. Slippage bites. A day trading rug pull yanks the floorboard, and your clever overlay becomes a trap door. You call it courage. It is actually a volume dial for fear. The story moves to real-time signal services, minute-by-minute tactics, rented authority. That is the same dependency with a new logo. You outsource the part of the game that hurts the waiting, the doubt, the variance, and replace it with pings that feel like certainty injections. but nothing in the narrative changes. Why would it? If the root problem is your demand for precision without pain, then piping in someone else's call only deepens the debt. You are still buying conviction because you cannot carry it. And that timeline, 2 or 3 years, sits like a brick at the end of your paragraph. It is not incidental. It is an admission that the carousel can run long enough to swallow multiple accounts, multiple identities, multiple promises you made to yourself in the dark. People quit here, the text says. Of course they do. The market does not only drain money, it drains the fantasy that you can beat uncertainty with. Cosmetics. Here is the quieter, nastier point baked into your own words. If every switch gives short-term relief from judgment, and each failure gets blamed on the last tool, then what exactly do you think your brain learns after year 2? Does it learn markets? Or does it learn to dodge accountability so cleanly that even success would not recognize where to land? You want the part nobody likes to hear. The systemic rot in stage 2 is not on the chart. It is baked into the way you measure reality. You say you cannot trade with an empty head, so you cram it full of features and call it progress. Complexity becomes a costume for control. You stack moving averages, Fibonacci ornaments, support and resistance lattices, pivots, fractals, divergence, DMI, ADX clink, 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 and mistake the sound of tools hitting the floor for the sound of work. Here is the kicker buried inside your own description. You rarely let any method survive a normal cycle of randomness. You sample tiny. You judge fast. You switch quicker. That is not testing. That is outcome chasing dressed up in scientific lighting. You bounce because the stop loss stings. And the story you tell yourself is that the system failed. But look closer. What you actually reject is variance. You treat randomness like a diagnosis rather than a cost of doing business. The tape says maybe, and you hear no. So you run to the next method that promises fewer maybes and more yeses. That is how you build a dependency on precision the market does not owe you. The indicator soup whispers exactness, and exactness feels like safety. But the market hum is probabilities, not prophecies. You do not want a distribution. You want a guarantee. That desire is the real system you are running, and it outvotes everything on your screen. You add to losers because your architecture predicts a reversal, not because price actually flips. That is a subtle but lethal distinction. You are not reading the tape. You are defending a thesis. The longer it bleeds, the louder the thesis shouts in your head. It becomes identity level. My configuration is right. The market is late. So you become the last one to admit the obvious. The position does not feel like risk. It feels like reputation. That is why the red line grows one small scoop at a time until the equity curve exerts gravity thud and you call it bad luck. What it really is, obedience to a model that you promoted to ruler because it flatters your need to be surgical. You wade into groups, see consistent green, and decide it cannot be real. Maybe some are front-running their own narratives. Sure. But your default accusation serves a different purpose. If they are frauds, then you are righteous. If they are not, then your process shrinks under a harsh light. The refusal to hold that tension is how you keep the carousel spinning. The chat becomes a mirror maze where every path leads back to your favorite answer. It was not me. It was the system. That keeps him, the ego intact and the drawdown alive. Then leverage. The text basically admits you turned the dial after being warned not to. Not because you measured an edge and scaled. Because a single oversized win would end the embarrassment and christen your custom build as legit. That is not scaling. That is bargaining. Each click magnifies noise and drags your decisions down into the microstructure where slippage bites and whips saw like a buzz saw. You mistake intensity for improvement. Louder is not clearer. Bigger is not smarter. The market does not grade effort. It weighs risk. Signal services arrive next. A glossy shortcut. Renting conviction feels like relief. Ding direction. Ding entry. Ding exit. But your own narrative shows what that really trains. You outsource the muscle that trading requires the tolerance for uncertainty, and you let it atrophy. The pings become crutches. When they miss, you blame the provider. When they hit, you do not build your own read. Either way, feedback that should have shaped your internal map slides off. You call it community. It is dependency with a monthly invoice. And time those 2 or 3 years say something you might not want to parse. The clock is not just ticking on accounts. It is etching a habit loop. Each switch buys you short-term relief and long-term confusion. Each accusation saves face and destroys data. Each add to loser saves pride and taxes capital. The loop becomes your operating system. Even if you stumbled onto a durable method, would you recognize it through the noise your brain now prefers? Or would you sabotage it the first time variance knocked, just to keep your favorite story alive? Here is the bitter seam running through your own words. You are not only searching for a profitable approach, you are searching for a way to win that never threatens your self-image. That is why complexity seduces. Why leverage tempts. Why rented signals soothe. They all promise control without exposure. But exposure is the toll road of this game. So, the hard question becomes unavoidable as we turn the page. When naive control fantasies meet the market's indifferent math, which side do you think bends first, the tape or the person clinging to an illusion of precision? You want contrast. Here is the split screen you tried not to show. On the left sits the stage 2 myth. The more ingredients you pour into the chart, the more control you feel. On the right sits the market's plain face, variance that does not apologize, distributions that do not flatter, sequences that bruise even clean logic. Your narrative worships the left panel moving averages braided like a charm bracelet, Fibonacci loops drawn with priestly care, support and resistance stacked like sandbags, pivots, fractals, divergence, DMI, ADX, the whole orchestra tuned to the note of certainty. Then price coughs once KH and the right panel laughs. Naive thinking says precision cancels pain. Harsh reality says pain is the toll for staying in the game. You claim uniqueness because your indicator recipe feels custom. Reality does not care about your initials on the toolbox. The tape pays on execution quality under uncertainty, not on aesthetics. Stage 2 thinking treats each stop out like a verdict against identity. Ash, you are wrong, so the fix becomes switching costumes. Reality treats each stop out like one line in a long paragraph. You read single sentences and declare the story broken. The market writes chapters. That mismatch is the hidden corner your text keeps pointing at without naming it. You are grading methods on whether they spare your nerves, not on whether they survive a full weather system. You chase tops and bottoms because the colored lines frame a world where reversals ring a bell. Reality rings no bells. It gives ranges that smear entries, breakouts that fake, pullbacks that sting, and trends that chew anyone who insists on being a hero. The naive view calls adding to losers conviction. Reality whispers it is just inertia with lipstick. When the model says, turn now, and price says, not yet, the naive mind defends the model. Reality defends the account. You step into groups where green screenshots look like a daily harvest and ask a barrage of questions that, on replay, sound like a plea for the market to obey scripts. Naive thinking labels others liars when their outcomes do not teleport to your P&L. Reality suspects something dull and unglamorous. Those people may be doing less, repeating more, and riding the variance instead of trying to outlaw it. Your tech skirts that possibility because it threatens the core comfort of stage 2, believing the edge lives in newness rather than in endurance. Leverage becomes the stage 2 megaphone. Turn it up. Drown out doubt. Grab one big win. End the search boom. Reality registers. Leverage as gravity. It pulls errors faster, makes slippage bite deeper, drags tiny misreads into crater territory. Naive thinking equates size with seriousness. Reality equates size with fragility. The same click that feels like courage is often just the volume knob on fear. Then the rental signals. Ding, direction. Ding, entry. Ding, exit. Naive thinking calls it efficiency. Reality calls it borrowed conviction that teaches your decision muscle to atrophy. When the pings miss, the blame discharges outward. When they hit, the insight does not anchor inward. Either way, your own narrative confirms it. Nothing fundamental changes because the need being fed is not knowledge. It is comfort. The feed is steady. The spine stays soft. Your text admits this loop can run 2 or 3 years and burn through multiple accounts. Naive thinking shrugs, no sweat, next tool. Next provider. Next tweak. Reality raises an eyebrow. That is not exploration. That is compulsion. The hidden corner is behavioral, not technical. You are not only switching systems, you are reinforcing a reflex that judges anything by how quickly it soothes uncertainty. The longer that reflex runs, the less any method can show you its real face. Even a viable approach starves when it is forced to deliver certainty on command. Stack the panels again. Left, uniqueness. Precision. A shortcuts. Leverage. Righteous suspicion of winners. Right, variance. Sample size. Boring repetition. Position, humility. Uncomfortable accountability. Your own words tilt the camera toward the left because the left flatters the ego and numbs the sting. The right is quiet, uncharismatic, and brutally consistent. You called the search a holy grail chase. Reality tags it a shield, a way to avoid being exposed to normal randomness. If that is true, then the exit from this hallway will not be a new indicator or a new signal feed. It will be a different posture toward uncertainty. But if the myth is how you protect yourself, what happens when you strip it? What posture is even left to stand on? An alternative read of stage 2 does not look like a shinier toolbox. It looks like a different contract with randomness. If the old contract was, "Spare me the pain and I will believe," the new one sounds more like, "Show me the range and I will measure." Same charts, and we want to place. Same candles. But the emphasis shifts. Instead of asking indicators to predict, they get demoted to context. Price action becomes the witness, not the defendant. The hunt for the Holy Grail morphs into something duller and tougher, tolerating sequences where clean logic still gets slapped, whack, and staying intact anyway. That shift reframes your indicator soup. Moving averages, Fibonacci, support and resistance, pivots, fractals, divergence, DMI, ADX. Keep them if they anchor your eye, but drop the fantasy that their combination grants immunity. The useful test is not, does this nail tops and bottoms? It is, does this produce behavior you can repeat when the tape snarls? The market already told you in your own words that constant switching prevents learning. So picture the opposite. A method sits on probation long enough to see weather, not just a breeze. Not a decree, not a rule, just a colder lens. The verdict waits for a real sample, not the first sting. The add to loser reflex gets a similar rewrite. In the stage 2 frame, you add because the model says, turn here. In the alternative frame, size and invalidation are welded together. The position is not a vehicle for proving a thesis. It is a probe with a fuse. If price keeps bleeding drip, drip, your fuse burns and the probe dies by design. That sounds clinical because it has to. Once entries stop carrying your reputation, exits stop feeling like admissions of guilt. The stop does not insult you. It timestamps a hypothesis that missed by the distance you budgeted. Tuition paid, lesson logged, identity untouched, groups and green screenshot theaters. The alternative read treats them as potential mirrors, not verdicts. If someone posts consistent gains, the question tilts from, are they lying to, what are they repeating that I refuse to stomach? Often it is something culturally unsexy, position humility, boring execution, an allergy to tinkering mid-sequence. You do not need their secret. You need their boredom tolerance. The minute the brain realizes that new is a sedative, not an edge, those rooms stop provoking you and start indexing you against your own reflexes. Leverage flips from megaphone to microscope. Instead of using size to drown doubt, size becomes the tool that makes variance survivable. That does not mean tiny forever. It means the volume knob tracks evidence rather than emotion. In stage 2, size rises to silence, embarrassment. In the alternative posture, size rises only when the method has endured stretch and snap without warping your behavior. Think of it like stress testing a bridge before trucks roll over it. If the bridge shakes when a bicycle crosses creek, what do you think a convoy will do? Signal services get recast from surrogate brains to temporary scaffolds. If you keep them, they are there to compare frameworks, not to outsource guts. The ping says, long here. Your chart says, context looks heavy. And the spread between those two reads becomes the lesson. When their call aligns with your filter and still loses, you log variance instead of rage unsubscribing. When it hits against your filter, you study what your filter omitted. Either way, your muscle is trained, not replaced. That is the whole point. Rented conviction should shrink over time, not metastasize into your identity. The timeline 2 or 3 years of carousel also gets reframed. It is not a prophecy. It is a budget for rewiring. If you have already invested that long in pain, the sunk cost can finally buy something, a taste for repetition. The moment the brain accepts that most edges are narrow, most entries are smeared, and most outcomes are messy, you stop asking methods to erase discomfort and start asking them to contain it. That is the escape hatch hiding in your own text. Not a new indicator. A narrower promise. None of this is romantic. It will not make your chart feel cinematic or your day feel cleaner. The soundtrack is still stop-loss hiss, shh, mixed with the occasional victory pop. But here is the practical relief tucked inside the bitterness. Once the game stops being a referendum on your genius, the variance stops feeling like an insult. What used to trigger a system switch becomes just noise within budget. And what used to feel like a miracle win becomes just positive variance you refuse to worship. If that is the stance that exits stage 2, then the next turn of the knife asks the only question that matters. When the alibis are gone and the posture is plain, what do you anchor to when the tape keeps saying, maybe? Stage 2 only looks technical on the surface. The engine underneath is psychological debt, and the interest compounds in silence. The narrative you laid out is the billing statement, endless tool hopping, borrowed conviction, leverage as anesthesia, cynicism toward anyone green, and that long. Dull bleed stretched across 2 or 3 years. Strip the cosmetics and the shape is simple, a refusal to be exposed to randomness without a costume. I am not handing you a creed here. I am closing the loop you already drew. The structure is self-evident once you stop bargaining with it. You said you could not trade with an empty head, so you filled it until it rattled. That was not knowledge. That was insulation. The moving averages, the Fibonacci ornaments, the support and resistance scaffolds, the pivots and fractals, and divergence clatter. Clatter became a way to hear less of what the tape was saying. You were not naive about effort. You were naive about what effort buys. It does not buy certainty. It buys capacity. And capacity is ugly on the way up, smaller size. Longer probation, more boredom, less theater. The moment that distinction clicked, the entire logic of stage 2 stopped being mystical and started being mechanical. The compulsion to switch systems after a handful of outcomes was not an attention issue. It was an indictment avoidance strategy. A tiny sample plus a sharp stop, became a story about the method, not about variance. Later, the add to loser habit was not some faithful conviction. It was a ritual to preserve a thesis you had promoted to identity. The group skepticism did not protect you from scams. It protected you from mirrors. The signal subscriptions did not accelerate learning. They outsourced the muscles that trading requires until they atrophied. And leverage, that ever-ready megaphone, it turned fear into volume and called it courage, while whipsaws carved trenches through your equity. You already sketched the exit conditions without naming them. The alternative, posture, you hinted at demoting tools to context, treating price as witness. Allowing a method to live through weather is not romance. It is insulation cut to fit reality, not fantasy. A stop becomes a timestamp instead of a character judgment. A loser does not beg for additions. It honors the fuse you built into the position. A winner does not crown the system. It reminds you that noise also runs in your favor and deserves no worship. The groups stop being theaters and turn into calibration grids. What someone else repeats that you refuse to stomach is an index of your own tolerance gaps, not a conspiracy. There is nothing heroic in any of this. It is all subtraction. You subtract the promise that indicators can outlaw pain. You subtract the idea that leverage can erase time. You subtract the theater of novelty and, over a stupid number of ordinary trades, you watch a plain habit loop replace the charismatic loop that bled you. The habit loop is dull and vicious in its own way. Define the action. Define the invalidation. Execute. Log. Repeat. The only drama is internal. Can you keep walking while the tape says maybe for longer than your ego wants? That is where stages actually shift. Not when a low dashboard lights up like an arcade. The bite is in the implication you kept circling. The Holy Grail was never a tool. It was permission. Permission to be uncertain without losing status in your own head. Without that permission, stage 2 drags on until accounts die or interest dies or both. With it, the chart does not get kinder. You get harder, quieter, cheaper to rattle. You will still hear the hiss of stops, and feel the dull thud of sequences that bruise clean logic. You will still be tempted by the fresh paint of a new indicator bundle and the siren ping of rented signals. But the reflex that once flipped the carousel will start flipping a different switch. Do less. Log more. Test longer. Size. Only when the bridge does not creak under a bicycle. Not a doctrine. A posture that simply makes quitting less attractive than enduring. If this sounds sterile, it is because stage 2 thrives on drama and the exit lives on monotony. You do not graduate by proving you are right. You graduate by ceasing to need that proof on every trade. The market will still catch you leaning and slap-whack your confidence. You will still have days when the distribution feels like a personal grudge. But something small and irreversible changes. You stop negotiating with randomness like it owes you a receipt. You start charging rent to your own bad habits. And without any trumpet. Stage 2 ends in a sentence so plain, it almost melts into the noise. You stop chasing a version of trading that insulates your identity and accepted the one that simply preserves your capital long enough to learn. If my words landed like a gut punch, share this with your crew. Subscribe to Flow State Trading if you want more of these raw breakdowns delivered without sugar. If the sting keeps you awake tonight, thanks for watching. No sweat. Let it. That is the one kind of pain that finally pays you back.